Greetings. My name is Anita Wills, and I am a writer and an author, and I'm Afro-Indigenous, and I'm here today on Independence Day. And it's actually the end of Independence Day, the 4th of July. And I am speaking from the perspective of someone who is a member of the DAR, Daughters of the American Revolution, through my ancestor, Charles Lewis. And he served in the Revolutionary War out of Fredericksburg, Virginia, with his brother, Ambrose Lewis. And Ambrose and Charles were seamen. They were actually little more than teenagers when the Revolutionary War broke out, and they were on a boat on the Rappahannock. And what they were doing was they were going up and down the Rappahannock, delivering packages, and sometimes they would take trash on the galley page, which is where they were at the time. They had been sent to do indentures because of their status as mulattoes. And they were working on those indentures when the war broke out, and the brothers signed on as seamen for the Navy. So they were actually, they called them seamen back then. And they probably, being so young, they thought it would be exciting because they liked what they did. They were on a boat on the galley page going up and down the Rappahannock. What a life, But after they joined, they remained on the galley page for some time before they removed themselves to the dragoon ship, which was also on the Rappahannock in Virginia. So they became seamen, and they served 3 years on the galley page during the Revolutionary War, and that was their first stint as Revolutionary War soldiers. After the Revolutionary War, not after they completed their 3 years as seamen, they became militia. They joined the militia out of Fredericksburg, and they were under Captain Gates, or General Gates. They went to South Carolina and fought at the Battle of Camden. So being in the Revolutionary War, the highlights are the battles that you fought at. They fought at the Battle of Camden, Ambrose and Charles, still relatively young men. And Ambrose was bayoneted clean through and shot 9 times and still lived to tell his story. And that battle, the Battle of Camden, South Carolina, was a losing battle. And Ambrose was taken prisoner, and he remained on the prison ship for until the end of the war. He was a barber on the prison ship, but during that time, a barber did more than just cut hair. He also was cutting off limbs, of those who were injured and or who had infections. So he would cut their appendages off too. And he was like a medical person. And at the end of the war, of course, the last battle was up at the Battle of Yorktown, at the Battle of Yorktown, and that was a losing battle. So once the Battle of Yorktown was over and the English, the British were defeated, then the prisoners were released, and Ambrose was released, and he was reunited with Charles, who has survived without injury. And Ambrose lived to be well into his 80s with his injuries. And he worked as a drayman. And for those who don't know what a drayman is, he would go down, he would take a cart down to pick up stuff off the ships that were docked at Fredericksburg, and he would move stuff, and he got paid to do that. Um, or he would go get stuff off the ships and he would sell them, and that was how he made a living, even with all the injuries that he suffered. And once the capital was settled in D.C., once the capital was established in D.C., Ambrose and his son, he took his son with him, uh, went to stay in Alexandria um, while he traveled back and forth to D.C. because he was at the first Senate meeting to testify that he had been injured during the Revolutionary War, and he was applying for a pension on his behalf and on Charles Lewis's behalf, his brother and my direct ancestor. So he was successful. He did get a pension, and he eventually returned to Fredericksburg, and he was married and had several children. Charles remained in Richmond, in the Richmond area, and Charles was much more prominent because he remained in that area where they call Rocket's Landing. And if you ever look up Rocket's Landing, it's a place where they allowed people of color or mulattoes, colored people, to do business. If you were free, you could go to Rocket's Landing in Richmond, Virginia, and do business. And Charles was someone who became wealthy at Rocket's Landing. He owned property. He was married. He had several children, and he was the person who received the tariff for the ships that came the through the river that was that's up there by Richmond, Virginia. So he was on that river, and he was in control of the locks. And if you didn't pay him, those locks didn't go up and you didn't go through. So Charles had had quite a bit of influence in Richmond as far as in that community that he operated in. They did not have a lot of influence outside of their community, which was the so-called mulatto or free persons of color community. And so his daughter, who is my direct ancestor, Nancy Lewis, was in Fredericksburg. She didn't spend her time in Richmond. She was more in Fredericksburg, where Ambrose and the other family members were. And I believe that Charles sometimes traveled on he was also a seaman, and he moved products on the sea up and down, the also again up and down the Rappahannock River, or he oversaw the moving of those products. And Ambrose's wife, Fanny, was purchased by Charles and freed and to marry Ambrose. So Ambrose and Charles kept, they were close throughout their lives. And when Ambrose asked Charles, told Charles rather, he wanted to marry Fanny, Charles made sure that she was free to marry. And these are my ancestors, Ambrose and Charles Lewis. And and their deeds during the Revolutionary War were hidden. I had to go find them. And I found them at the College of William and Mary at one of their departments that held archives and records for when the colonies was being established, and I found their records, and also another ancestor that was in the Revolutionary War was was Raleigh Penn and his brother Robert and Robert's sons, Billy, John, and James were all soldiers during the Revolutionary War at Yorktown battlefield. And that was the last battle of the Revolutionary War. Also, John Redcross, who was a brother-in-law to uh, my ancestor Raleigh Penn. So there was they marched down from Amherst County, which is up by it's all the way over by West Virginia, um, and Raleigh and Sarah had married and owned property up there, and they were a part of the Native American community because Raleigh was Wacomical. He came from Lancaster County, Virginia, and he the tribe that he belonged to, Wacomical, were were in Lancaster County at the time, and he lived. They called it Indian Town where they lived, and it was right on the ocean. Um, and they had been dispersed. The natives there had been dispersed by the colonial government, and so Raleigh, after he served at an indenture, went into the interior. And some people say that he was a scout, that he took people into the interior because he knew people like John Redcross, who was up in Yorktown. He knew him, and they met up there, and they all went together to Amherst County, and they were the first settlers of Amherst County, Virginia. Um, and they marched down during the Revolutionary War. They marched with Marcus de Lafayette, the general, and his unit. So they met up with Marcus de Lafayette, or Lafayette as he's called, down to the battlefield in Yorktown. And during the battle, Robert Penn, who was the brother of Raleigh, his son James, was killed. He called him Jim. He said Jim was killed during that battle, and they lost. He was lost. He died in the Revolutionary War at Yorktown battlefield. So after the war, he returned back to Raleigh, and John Redcross returned back home, and they owned land. Raleigh was a farmer. His son James, who is my direct ancestor, and him were, they were farmers. They owned land, and by the river up there, there was a river up there, and they bought land by the river, and did fishing and was self-sustaining. And the part I want to say about that is that all the land that my ancestors had before the Revolutionary War, and all their accomplishments were taken from them. The more that Europeans were coming into the colony, the more land was lost. The jobs, the position that Charles Lewis had was lost to a white person who was coming from Europe, because they were passing laws to take away all that these ancestors had gained fighting during the Revolutionary War. It was the same with Raleigh Penn. His land was being stripped from him by these people that worked for the county that were charging him taxes and then saying he didn't pay the taxes. And if he fought back and said could prove it, because Raleigh knew how to write. I have documents and deeds with his signature on it. He was not illiterate. He wasn't ignorant. And so he would go, to court to fight and was losing because they were encroaching on his land and taking the land that they have worked so hard to keep, and it was lost. And Raleigh Penn, it is said that he was shot and killed sometime around 1801. And another thing that Raleigh is known for up in that region, he was a Baptist preacher. He was an Anabaptist, and they were fighting against slavery. And even though he had been in the Revolutionary War fighting to end slavery, it continued after the war. And Raleigh was, he worked with other pastors in the region and set up a church that is still standing to this day, and it's called Fairmount Baptist Church. The church has been burned down several times over the decades, and they have continued to rebuild it. It's still standing and it's still operational. And the first pastor of that church was Raleigh Penn. And his grandson, my great-great-grandfather, Robert A. Penn, was also a Baptist minister and had a church in Philadelphia. And so, it continued. And I always want to highlight that we were participants, that whatever's going on in America, we were there. We did not just arrive. We're not new. We've been here. Like they say, we've been here, done that. And the Revolutionary War that was fought, most of the people that were in it thought they were fighting to end slavery. And that's what we have to remember, is that even though they themselves were free, they wanted to lift up others and, so they would be free. And that is, to me, something that we sometimes are lacking in this age where everything is fast and right at our fingertips, is that the compassion and the caring for those who are suffering, or for those who are not receiving the so-called justice that America is supposed to be built on. And we have to call that out. And my belief is that we, as people of color, just like the people in Texas who were not free, who were free, and were not told that they were free for like 2 years. They did not know. And that we should have our own separate 4th of July celebration for our ancestors who are left out of the books that they write. Because our history is American history. Lest we forget, we need never forget, our history is American.